Did Horikoshi's fear of being cancelled ruin the writing of MHA? And did he change or remove storylines to appease fans? That's something I'm going to try to answer in this video. Even as early as the first volume of My Hero in 2014, the manga was successful, selling out of the initial print almost immediately. And the success of the manga would continue to climb until its peak around 2018, when it was the second best-selling manga with 6.7 million copies sold in Japan, being only surpassed by One Piece that year. With the manga coming to an end in 2024, it would be an understatement to call MHA successful. Currently, it sits on a short list of 23 mangas that have reached over 100 million copies sold. But critical success wasn't something Horikoshi had experienced in the world of manga. In fact, he'd experienced two failures with his previous works. His first serialized work, Omagadoki Zoo, ran for 37 chapters, while his second, Barrage, lasted only 16 chapters before both were cancelled due to low readership. It's a harsh reality for many mangakas in such a competitive field, but I doubt that softens the blow when it's your work you've poured your heart into getting cancelled. So why bring up these past failures anyway? Well, I'm hoping to understand Horikoshi's mind following the cancellations of these works and going into his success with MHA. And I think a perfect place to start is by looking at the final pages of his cancelled works. I won't be reading the entire page, so feel free to pause and read the whole thing, but for Omagadoki Zoo, he starts by saying, "First of all, thank you from the bottom of my heart for reading. With this volume, the transformation story of Sheena, Hana, and all the animals has come to a conclusion. Thank you so much for supporting me. I can't help feeling glad that my first serialization was read at all. Week after week I put pencil to page, thinking fervently, please read, always worrying whether they'd read my work, whether they'd find it interesting. Every day, it was trial and error. A manga is complete when it is read, and there's only you to thank for allowing me to complete this Omagadoki Zoo at 37 chapters. And now I have no space left. The time has come." From reading this passage, I get a feeling of defeat and unease as he talks about worrying if his first serialized work will be read at all. But ultimately, I think the afterword ends with an optimistic note for future works. That future work would be Barrage, but unfortunately for Horikoshi, it only lasted 16 chapters. And the afterword for Barrage gives a much more somber tone than the previous one. What the heck did I just draw? It reeks of the 90s, doesn't it? Like when a manga artist pops up inside their manga. This is what you get when you draw without sleeping or even thinking. Anyway, thank you very much for reading Barrage. Thank you very much. It's the only thing I can think of to say. I'm really grateful. You have no idea how much your support matters. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Okay, see you all around. Oops, I really hope to see you all again someday. Goodbye. I think it's clear from this that he took the cancellation of Barrage harshly. He ends the final paragraph with a goodbye, and it seems like it could be the end of original works for Horikoshi. And looking at a recent interview, we'll learn that that was nearly the case. I had 2 series cancelled and I thought, I'm done with manga. The editor in charge at the time told me, don't give up and do your best, so I thought, let me give it one more try. And I decided to draw with all the things I like and only the things I'm good at drawing. For those of you that are unaware, MHA originally appeared as a one-shot titled Boku no Hero. It's quite different from the MHA we know, but his editor knew that this one-shot had a special place in his heart, so he encouraged him to turn it into his next serialized work. And as I mentioned before, MHA became successful quickly after he began publishing. In researching for this video, I came across an old blog post from around the time MHA debuted. They talked about Horikoshi's previous works before ending by praising Horikoshi for his improvements since Barrage. After reading the first chapter of this series, I could clearly see Horikoshi's improvement in art and story compared to Barrage. However, I was left with the feeling that this series would also get cancelled. And I believe they weren't the only ones that felt this way. With Horikoshi's last shot at manga, he'd found success, and it's hard to imagine his past cancellations didn't haunt him. Which leads me to comments Horikoshi made during an interview in 2022 that led me to making this video. Now, I'm going to read the whole thing, but I want you to remember that his first manga was cancelled after 37 chapters. So in this interview, when he's talking about volumes 8 to 11, that's chapters 63 to 99. So while at this point MHA would still have been his longest running series, it wasn't ahead by that much. Volume 8 is also around the time the anime began airing. The stage play version of MHA has finally made it here. This is around volumes 8 to 11 of the manga. I remember things being quite hard at that time. I was really busy. Spoiler warning, if you don't know the story already, then be sure to read this after you see the play, like sometime when you're really bored and have nothing to do but shave your legs. Up until the summer training camp, the series had a pretty steady amount of popularity, but the moment I hinted that there were villains coming, crash, the popularity suddenly dropped. Sorry for talking about this, but I guess people didn't want them there. I already planned the storyline and I couldn't just have the villains leave without doing anything. I decided to cut short some of the things I was planning to do during the summer training camp and hurried to the next battle. The next battle. The All Might versus All for One fight. If All Might is there, everything will be okay. I relied on All Might and bet on him. I think the world within the story and the reader's hearts were in sync. That's just how important All Might's existence is to me. Without All Might, I don't think the My Hero Academia manga would have come to be loved by everyone for so long. All Might answered my call and helped me make the manga go beyond what it was before. I'm sure readers have absolutely no interest in this, but as the author, that's how important this big scene for All Might is to me. Personally, I'm excited to see how they'll bring this to life with a 2.5 stage play. I'm going to talk about what he said shortly, but first I want to look at this drop in popularity he mentions. We don't have an exact chapter, but he mentions 3 things. Volumes 8 to 11, when the villains were teased to make an entrance, and popularity was steady up until the summer training camp. I believe this will be around chapter 67, which is near the end of the final exam arc. The chapter follows the final exams of the UA students before transitioning to the League of Villains for the last 2 pages. Here we are reintroduced to Dabi and Toga. Though they made their debut 10 chapters earlier, here we see them properly introduced as they join the League of Villains. Chapter 68 continues from the last chapter, largely focused on the villains, before ending with Shigaraki confronting Deku, and chapter 69 continues this confrontation. The next chapter, chapter 70, is the first chapter that begins the Forest Training Camp arc. If we look at the dates these chapters were released, we have chapter 67 releasing November 16th, 2015, and chapter 69 releasing November 30th, 2015. Now, I want you to remember these dates. This was the range I decided to look at to see how much sales were dropping. After spending some hours searching, I'm certain of one thing. It's really hard to find data on specific chapter sales because most publications only share volume sales. Not to mention most of the original data is in Japanese, which I don't speak, but regardless, I did find something. First, keep in mind that the dates refer to the original chapter release dates, not the volume release dates. Volume 8 was released in Japan on April 4th, 2016. Looking for sales reports in 2015, I came across an old defunct blog that had been compiling lists of weekly manga volume sales from 2008 to 2016. Looking into the blog further, they themselves had been collecting their data from someone by the name of Snow, who worked on the My Anime List news team. And they had been sourcing their data from Oricon. So what is Oricon? Well, for the purposes of this video, all you need to know is they're a Japanese company that tracks domestic sales of different forms of media, manga being of particular interest to us. But, and this is a big but, they only track physical sales of manga in selected stores. So while there are around 40,000 stores they're partnered with as of 2011, it's still not all the stores that sell manga. Also, this means that all foreign and digital sales, including all those that read My Hero through online subscriptions like Shonen Jump, won't be included. With that being said, let's look at some numbers. So, there are no available chapter sales numbers, so I decided to look at the nearest volume to release around November 2015, and that was Volume 6. In its first week, Volume 6 sold roughly 175,000 copies, which is around 20,000 copies less than Volume 5 in its first week. Volume 7 continued this slight downtrend, selling around 26,000 less copies in its first week when it released in February 2016. So I think this is evident that we're looking around the area where Horikoshi noticed this sales drop and changed the story. Now, Volume 8 is the volume that actually contains the chapters we mentioned previously, and as you can see, there is a pretty big jump in sales. And that's because the anime also started airing in 2016. So from Volume 8 onwards, you see a continued growth through to Volume 11 and beyond. As I mentioned before, we don't have specific chapter sales or readership numbers, so we don't know exactly how low these numbers were for his previous works before they got cancelled. So we'll have to look at them in terms of volume sales. However, because readership was so low, their sales numbers, even for volume sales, don't show up online. At least I couldn't find them. But we can make a somewhat educated guess. As I looked at the years of volume sales, I noticed that for any given week, the lowest sale numbers in the top 50 will be around 20 to 30,000, with the top 10 often being over 100,000. So I think it's safe to assume that his cancelled works were somewhere close to 10,000 or even much lower for them being cancelled so suddenly. But for argument's sake, let's say they sold 30,000 copies for their first week. If we compare that to volume 6 and 7, it's still nowhere remotely close. Volume 6 in its first week was the third best-selling manga that week, while Volume 7 was the best-selling manga that week. So even as the sales were dropping, it was still one of the best-selling mangas at the time. And this got me wondering, if the sales were dropping, but it was still ranking so highly, was there something else happening around 2015 to 2016 in Japan that could affect manga sales? Well, potentially yes. Right around the release of Volume 6 in November 2015, Japan entered a recession, so it is possible that the slight downshift in sales may have nothing to do with the villains appearing at all. Now, I understand it's a bit presumptuous of me to think that, considering all the data I've told you that I'm missing. But I bring this up because I want to ask you a question. Yes, you. Do you think this drop in sales is reason enough to change the story you've already planned? I want to know if you think at this point with these sale numbers, if it's reasonable to make changes like this, or if you think Horikoshi was afraid that his last shot at manga would get cancelled like his previous works. Funny, this ties into the title of the video, almost like I planned it. Before I move on, I'll go over some counter arguments. The biggest, of course, being that this data has no account for digital sales or readership numbers on platforms like Shonen Jump Plus, which is most likely the majority of views and sales, with this being a Shonen Jump series. So it's definitely believable that Horikoshi had access to these figures and saw a steep decline in the numbers as soon as the villains showed up. It's also possible that, had he not changed the story, volume sales would have continued to decline if not for the anime. We'll just never know. I think, regardless of whether he changed the story or not at this point, Volume 8 would have seen this boost because of the anime. Alright, I think I've spent enough time looking at sales numbers, so let's go back to what Horikoshi actually said. At the start of this video, I said I hope to answer two questions. One being whether or not Horikoshi changed or removed storylines to appease fans. As we can see from Horikoshi himself, the answer is yes, he did. So why is this a bad thing? Well, I think if you do this as an author, you're opening a can of worms where you're making changes to please the fans, and as a result of that, the original vision for the story takes a backseat, with the wants of the audience taking the lead. And in the world of TV, books, movies, etc., I don't think that's always a good thing. Of course, there are exceptions. Game of Thrones Season 8, for example. The ideas that the showrunners had were so much worse than what the majority of the fans actually wanted. You'll often see works that aim to do nothing more than to please the fans be referred to as fan service or fan fiction. But why is this bad? There are certainly good fan fictions out there, but the majority are written by kids and teenagers, which don't typically make the best writers. On top of that, you'll find a lot of fan fictions revolve around some sort of event or idea that the writer wants to see, regardless of how much sense it would make in the original work. So if an author writes something that is inconsistent with the story and world that's already established, you may see it referred to as fan fiction as an insult. Wouldn't it be cool if Rey had a yellow lightsaber? But how did she know how to make it? When did she make it? Where did she get the Kyber crystal? Wouldn't it be cool if Palpatine returned? Okay, but how the hell did he survive this?
We've decoded the intel from the First Order spy, and it confirms the worst. Somehow Palpatine returned.
Dark science. Cloning. Secrets only the Sith knew.
Wouldn't it be cool if Holdo flew into the supremacy at light speed and killed everyone? Okay, but that's not how light speed works. Is it obvious that I hate Disney Star Wars yet? In the case of My Hero, with it being a shonen manga, not all, but a large majority of its audience are young teens, so I think it's short-sighted to change the story when popularity dropped once the villain showed up. especially when you don't know if this drop in popularity is going to continue once the villains actually start to impact the plot the way you initially envisioned. As the author, Horikoshi should know why the villains are showing up now, whereas for the audience, as we read the manga for the first time, we might not know if there's any significance to their timing, and if there is, we may only appreciate it in hindsight. The reason why this concerns me so much isn't necessarily because of this one example Horikoshi gives of him changing the story. It's the precedence it sets, that if he's done it once, he could have done it many other times, and I wonder if that's what constituted the fall-off in writing quality I felt when reading the manga, at least in my opinion.
No, that's not an opinion, it's a fact.
One author that has talked about the concerns of authors changing their stories in response to fans is Gurm. Granted, in this clip, Gurm is discussing fan theories about his novels. However, the sentiment can still apply to MHA.
And the other thing is, yeah, some of the theories were incredibly wrong-headed and amusing in that sense. Some of them were clever, and maybe I hadn't thought of them, but now I'm saying, that would be a good idea.
Have you done that?
No, I don't want to do that either, because then, then I'm like taking ideas from the fan. I want this to be my own ideas. And then the other one was, of course, I have certain things that I'm laying clues for, that there'll be revelations later on. Some people had put together those clues even as early as 1998 and are adding things together. I said, well, what do I do with that? What do I do with that? These people have guessed the secret that I'm going to reveal in book 6. People have already guessed that here, and book 2 is just out. You really have two choices there. You can ignore it and proceed with your plan, despite the fact that some people know where you're going. Or you can get all panicky and say, oh my God, they figured it out. I can't let that be. I'll have to change it. I'll have to go in a different direction. And I think some writers do that. And I think that's always a mistake.
Yeah.
If you've planned your book that the butler did it, and then you read on the internet, someone has figured out that the butler did it, and you suddenly change in midstream and it was the chambermaid who did it, then you screw up the whole book, because you get this foreshadowing early on, and you've got these little clues you planted. Now they're dead ends, and you have to introduce other clues, and you're retconning. It's a mess. So I decided as early as Dragonstone's heyday, and I think that site had gone away by 2000 or so, that I would stay off the fan sites and let those be for the fans, let those be for the readers, let them argue their theories, whether they're right, whether they're wrong, but I don't need to know about that.
Another author that made comments that could apply here was the author of Dune, Frank Herbert, who said the following: "When I was writing Dune, there was no room in my mind for concerns about the book's success or failure. I was concerned only with writing. 6 years of research had preceded the day I sat down and put the story together, and the interweaving of the many plot layers I had planned required a degree of concentration I had never before experienced. There wasn't room in my head to think about much else. Following the first publication, reports from publishers were slow and, as it turned out, inaccurate. The critics had panned it. More than 12 publishers had turned it down before publication. I was a writer, and I was writing. The success meant I could spend more time writing. Looking back on it, I realized I did the right thing instinctively. You don't write for the success. That takes part of your attention away from the writing. If you're really doing it, it's all you're doing, writing." The other comment Horikoshi made that I found really interesting was his expression of reliance on All Might. It's not necessarily concerning, but it leads me to speculate on his reliance on other characters and their popularity with fans. I'm sure All Might did add to My Hero's popularity, and All Might is one of the more popular characters in My Hero Academia when looking at popularity polls. But even as early as the second poll, his popularity began to drop, and continued to do so with each subsequent poll. So while I somewhat agree, I also believe that if All Might had died during the first fight with All For One, the manga would have continued to grow in popularity. It makes me think that if he believes All Might was so important to the story, maybe that's why he was too afraid to kill him off. And if All Might, who isn't even the most popular character, is so important, then maybe that's why we almost never see the 3 most popular characters in serious danger. And when we do, it's usually fixed by a convenient deus ex machina. Just to name a few examples, you have Bakugo's death. He dies in chapter 362, but already by chapter 364, Edgeshot shows up with a convenient ability that allows him to revive Bakugo by repairing his heart. So even if you actually believed Horikoshi would kill off Bakugo, all the tension and emotion for this character only lasts 2 chapters because you know he's going to come back. Another's in chapter 404 with All Might about to die at All for One's hands before he's saved by the newly revived Bakugo, who's even quicker than before he died, when realistically he should struggle to stand at this point. Last one for now, which just made me roll my eyes the first time I read it. I think by this point in the manga, the amount of Deus Ex Machinas and plot contrivances had gotten to me to the point where whenever I saw a popular character in danger, I just didn't believe it. So, in chapter 419, we see Deku lying in a pool of blood, missing both his arms. But you don't have to wait long before we fix the problem of our main character having no arms, because at the end of the chapter, Eraserhead and some other classmates show up. And by this point, I checked out, because I just knew that they were going to use Eri's power to get his arms back. And sure enough, in the very next chapter, his arms are back. All of this adds to one complaint I have with My Hero's story, and that's the lack of stakes. While the story tries to build the stakes with all these powerful villains and world-ending threats, we rarely see the prominent characters feel the consequences of these villains. And I wonder if this lack of stakes is something to do with Horikoshi's mindset when he mentions the world within the story and the reader's heart being in sync, when All Might fought All for One. It got me thinking. So, obviously, he didn't want All Might to die. The world of MHA didn't want All Might to die, and finally the readers didn't want All Might to die, except me probably. So they all didn't want him to die, so Horikoshi wrote it that way. But what about when other, more popular characters are in danger? The civilians in the world don't want them to die. Readers obviously don't want them to die. But what if Horikoshi wants them to die? I guess what I'm trying to say is, I wonder if he's thinking about what the reader would want when making these decisions, and how much this affects his original ideas. Maybe I'm looking too much into this one part of what he said, but it at least shows us that he is thinking or looking into reader reactions when writing, otherwise how else would he know that the world and readers' hearts were in sync? I had originally planned for this video to look at different storylines that I believed Horikoshi had changed because of the fans, and discuss what I thought was or should have happened, but ultimately I decided against it because I thought it would be hypocritical of me to criticize him for listening to the fans too much, then tell him what he should have done. I definitely have a lot of criticisms for My Hero, and I could rant about it, but this video isn't the place. Anyway, let me know what you think of this video in the comments. I guess this is kind of new for me. I've made anime videos in the past, but none looked at comments from the authors. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching to the end. Bye. Do you remember those dates I told you to remember? November 16th and 30th, 2015. Good job if you